distracted if I do it now. I think you might give this a better I'll grab it. No. Good, thanks.
Did you get the email? Yeah. It was added to my calendar.
I'm good. How'd you bring back?
I was driving the boat. I went up to Camp Potlatch. I made 2 trips up there. It was super rough. And you always keep your hands on the throttle in the boat. And I guess it was just the way I was sitting, and like the smash it, so you're kind of defending yourself. Can't stop it. I can't stop it.
Need some body work of some sort.
Some good pharmaceuticals.
Yeah. First step for us, second step body work.
We just got the screen.
But I think celebrate for
Thanks everyone for coming as always. Appreciate you being here. I'm going to get started even though I think we're still waiting for Apollo, the RCMP representative, who I expect to be here. So if I could just get, I'm going to actually make some changes to the agenda. Sorry. If nobody has any objections, I want to just skip the action items, skip the organization updates, skip critical incident stress debriefing. I'm going to do that with the one-on-one with the first responder agencies. It's just a question. So I want to dedicate as much of this meeting as I can to the evacuation plan work and give the consultants the stage as soon as possible. Does anyone have any objections to skipping 4.1, 5.1, and 6.2?
Are we skipping them or just putting them at the end of the meeting?
No, they'll be next month, next time, maybe deferred, yeah. That's right. So hearing no objections, can I get an approval of the agenda, please? Thank you. Great. And then I'm sure you've all carefully reviewed the minutes from last meeting. Assuming, does anyone have any changes or corrections?
I did. I'm not by law.
Okay.
So that was the only thing, so.
Steph just changing Tessa's title. So,
Business license inspector?
Yes, and planning technician, either or both.
For these purposes,
It doesn't matter.
any other changes? Okay, hearing none, can I get someone to move the adoption of the minutes? Please. Thank you, Tess. Seconder, great, done. Okay, public comments. We have one member of the public here today. Did you want to say anything, Fetch?
I'm here because I'm now fascinated with the whole subject of evacuation, one, and concerned about coming fire season and public trail heads, notification signs and things like that going up, and the ongoing earthquake planning. And I'm glad you're all here, and I'm hoping to find a way to fit in.
And just to speak to that, we've talked with the consultants about how to engage the public in this process and what their role might be. So we're working on that piece on an ongoing basis. Okay, so I just really quickly want to go around the table and have everyone introduce themselves. I know not everybody's met, and then of course I'll introduce Rob and Scott from 3SI Risk Solutions, who are writing our evacuation plan with us. So everyone knows me. Maybe I'll go to Edward.
I'm Edward Walkman. I'm going to be helping Jennifer in her program as we move forward.
For those of you that don't know, that's the neighborhood emergency response people.
All right.
I'm Tess Taylor. I work with the municipality. I do training I've been training for EOC use and lots of training in ESS.
I'm Carolyn McDonald, and I'm the ESS director on the
Emma Chow, I also work for the municipality, Island Community Planner.
Scott Kessler, Horseshoe Bay, manager at the ferry terminal over there.
Bruce Steele, I also work for the municipality. I volunteer in ESS, and I also volunteer with emergency communications on the island.
Kevin Tage with the municipality. I work in public works.
Gary Twana with EMBC.
John Hawks with EMBC.
I'm Robin Benton. I have an official title. I'm a volunteer rapid damage assessment coordinator for the municipality.
Scott Raesler, I'm the president of Raesler Strategies, and I'm the principal consultant here helping develop the emergency evacuation.
And I'm Rob Stellish, I work with FreeSide as well.
Thanks, everyone. We're gonna jump straight into it. I love this meeting because it's not me talking the whole time.
Okay, I see we have a record fire.
Oh, sorry, Kevin's gonna be representing the Bowen Island Fire Department
Oh, yeah, that
because, sorry, both our fire chief and deputy fire chief are out today, unfortunately.
Okay, awesome. And we're still waiting on RCMP.
RCMP is on his way.
Right.
Should we wait?
It might be worthwhile, just so I don't do this spiel again, because it's obviously just going to keep people in, depends how far
Yeah.
it's going to be away.
Can't evacuate without him. He says he's on his way. Shouldn't be long. Is there anything we can do to get started?
I probably talk a bit about background, what we're going to do, so we can dive into deeper stuff and see what we can do for sure. Okay. Right. So, we're going to be doing something a little bit different, ladies and gentlemen, and I apologize until I get everybody's names. I'm horrible with names. I'm great with positions, so I'll probably be identifying you by your position initially, and then we'll get into the names as we go along. What we're going to be doing here is, we're calling it a facilitation, but it's really a facilitation designed to do fact-finding for us. This is really our first visit to the island at the start of the process. We've just done a fairly lengthy drive around the island looking at your designated muster locations, the various dock locations that would be primary to any evacuation of the island itself or partial zonal evacuation from parts of the island. Looking at the interconnected roadways, where your key junctions are within the municipality, of which there's several, that are essential to the movement of traffic that would be critical during evacuations. We spent our morning really getting that lay of the land so that we could see it in person. Both Rob and I obviously are from the mainland. We're not islanders, so we needed to understand that. What we're going to be doing in this session is trying to get a good understanding from your organizations, either external organizations. I think ENBC will definitely also be a player in this as well. I'm assuming you're both from the pre-op, or yeah, sorry. And we're going to be basically kind of using this as an opportunity for us to eliminate a whole bunch of individual interviews and try to gather information at one time, and we'll do it around a base scenario. None of what we're doing today is intended to put anybody on the spot. We get that you haven't shown up here with key refined plans and tons of detail. What we're really looking to gather out of today's session is what are the capabilities that each of your either internal municipal departments or external agencies bring to the table in support of an evacuation. Hence why we're very keen on making sure that the RCMP detachment commander is here. Learning what that is, learning what plans are actually in place. Certainly colleagues from ambulance, from BC Ferries being a huge enabler to anything that happens here on the island. Learn what those things are, what plans are in place, identify where gaps might exist, and then from there we're going to be doing a bit of a talk-through scenario as if there was a fire event, which we recognize realistically of all the hazards that are identified for Bowen, of which there's several in your hazard risk vulnerability assessment. Realistically, the one hazard that you are most concerned about that will cause either an internal evacuation of any size or an evacuation of the island entirely will be wildfire. That's the scenario that we're going to be focusing on and we'll be talking about here today. What we're not going to talk so much about is what are we doing to attack the fire, per se, beyond the initial assessment by fire. We're going to talk about that scenario driving us to consider evacuation of either a part of the island or the entire island and discuss the core issues that come around that. What are the logistics that happen with that? How easy and or difficult is it to move people from the island entirely or even across the island if certain arteries are cut off by the fire itself or by smoke or by other hazards? That's what we're here to discuss. Obviously the session is, we get more out of it the more you put into it. We're not looking to put anybody on the spot. No one's committing for the external agencies. No one's committing their organization to anything at today's table. This is just a fact-finding thing for us to identify where are there plans that are working very, very well, and where are there potential gaps that we would then, as we do our process going forward from here, that we need to identify with individual, more in-depth fact-finding with the individual agencies. Obviously, BC Ferries, I hate to break it to you, this will be the first of many conversations we're probably going to have. You guys are such a critical leader. And obviously, we want to make sure that we get that right. The same thing with ambulance, the other first responders, the volunteer fire department, the RCMP being critical enablers, the role of EMBC. One player that's not here that doesn't necessarily speak to the evacuation part, but will be part of things we're going to want to engage in later on, will be BC Wildfire Branch, just because they are such a critical component of fighting the fire outside of the immediate connection with the interface. And we will be having them in later sessions, particularly when we validate these plans that we roughly put together. So that's what we're talking about. I'll go into greater detail of how we're going to do each one of these pieces. But, and I recognize this is a public meeting, minutes are being taken, but the more you're open about what's going on, what your organization can bring to bear, we're not attempting to embarrass anybody because they don't have the perfect plan and it's laid out. That's not the intent of today's session. It's really about learning where are those things, what does the island municipality need to do on its end to create its plan to ensure that it meshes effectively with what BC Ferries might have for a plan, what EMBC can do to support, what external agencies can do to assist them, that type of thing, so that we know what those things are and we build the plan appropriately, as opposed to building a cookie cutter plan that goes and sits on a shelf but doesn't really apply to your community. That's not obviously what we're looking to do. So in a nutshell, that's what we're going to do. So before I kind of jump into that,
I just want to be really clear, I'm taking minutes for public record, I'm not creating a report out of what's happening here.
yeah, no, I understand. Sorry, I meant to say that publicly.
Okay.
Yeah. So, and I know I'm speaking incredibly fast, and if you can keep up with me, I'm going to buy you a wallet.
I got your name.
Scott.
There we go. Okay, so just so everybody understands that. So are there any questions I can answer for you now before we kind of dive in, as I continue to kind of try to buy time until our RCMP colleague shows up? No doubt he's fighting crime on the island, that's exactly what it is. So. Any questions I can ask about the process? We'll get into the individual pieces of it in more detail. If at any time you're not sure, let me know.
One thing I forgot to do was introduce Cherie. I'm so sorry, Cherie. Are you still there?
Oh.
It's okay. I knew that you had said my name initially. So yes, Cherie Hayes, manager for Metro Coast BC Ambulance. So that's Bowen Island, State Island, and all stations in between.
Thank you. And jump in anytime if you have any questions, Cherie.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Okay. So to put that in context, we're not expected to walking out of here with, aha, we're going to have a framework of a plan. That's not. Today is fact-finding, identifying capabilities, and identifying gaps. Then we take that information and we're going to go forward and start doing a much more detailed research so we have a good understanding of where those gaps exist, what we need to tighten up, and who we need to bring to the table to gather more information. So that's definitely what we're looking to do as we go forward. The overall intent of all of this, and I don't want to speak too much for Jennifer, but what her design and what the municipality's design is, at the end of this, you're going to be getting an evacuation plan that is specifically tailored to your unique community, that is unique to the challenges you face as a community with the logistics of getting on and off the island and around the island, as opposed to something that's just very, very, very generic. And at the end of this process, we'll be preparing that plan, and then we'll be taking that plan and actually validating it using a tabletop exercise to determine with pretty much all these same players and probably some additional ones like BC Wildfire, to actually ensure that the plan meets what it needs to do. Not just, okay, we've done it, here's our plan, there you go. We want it to be something that you actually have had a chance to have in your hands, practice with, use, see, kick it around to make sure that it functions the way you want it to. Does it work with our partner agencies like Ferries and others? And if it does, then that's what's going to become finalized and become ultimately the plan that will be formally issued. So I don't know if you want to add any more tailoring to the long-term intent.
That's good.
Okay. You can only tap dance so long before the RCMP show up.
I don't know if I'd wait for him.
Okay.
I'm not sure how.
All right. So I think I've done my larger spiel on what we're really trying to do out of this. We have, I know, 2 hours approximately budgeted. If we can do under that, that's fine. We're not trying to beat this to death either. And if people know what some potential takeaways are going to be for them, that they need to do a bit of a deeper dive into their own organizations to provide some follow-on information, then we've achieved our objective here. So we're not trying to just take this to death anyway. And the benefit of an island like this, for those that have to leave it, we're kind of hung by fairy time. So there you go. The usual, put your cell phones on mute or vibrate, please. I understand also a lot of you, though, are taking time away from what you're doing to be here. If you need to step away, please, by all means, do so. And then when you're done, come back in. It will be good. We will be taking a bit of a break. We do have an interesting array of various sweets around the table, and I believe there is coffee being made, so we'll look for an appropriate time midway, take a break for these sort of 5-10 minutes, and then allow you guys to get some refreshments. Okay. So I think I've talked through a few of these things and what we're looking to do, but what we're going to start with is literally a roundtable in your role or representing your organization is to discuss the rough outlines, and I'll be speaking a bit to this for our ambulance colleague who doesn't have this in front of her. We're going to be asking you for just what is the capability your organization could bring to bear in an evacuation. Not fighting the fires that drive the evacuation, but the evacuation itself. In some cases, you might not have any immediate role. It might be a follow-on role, ESS being a good example, where you may not be part of the very initial part of the evacuation, but you're going to be receiving people and then potentially having to move them on to other locations. So we'll be talking about those pieces of it and what those roles will be. I'm not expecting tons and tons of details and pages of planning, but just your thought processes of the capabilities you bring to bear on the island within ESS as an example. When we get to something like ferries, obviously we'll be asking you to speak to, as a subject matter expert, on this is the number of boats we have, this is their capability, this is how often we could run them, this is how we could re-roll boats to provide assistance, that type of thing will be immensely useful to us as a starting point. And the same thing obviously for ENBC and as enablers, really as the larger piece. And if there's anything for you gents that I miss, or you feel that this table really should know, by all means, as subject matter experts, jump in and let me know. Okay. Once we've done that kind of broad capability piece, we're going to then move into discussing, based on a scenario, I call it interoperability, but we're going to kind of almost talk our way through something happening on the island. If it was to happen, you'll see it's going to be next week, happen midweek. What would we do right now, just to talk our way through it, understanding what the capabilities are, what would the pieces be? Because from us, it's going to help us very quickly identify what are the perceptions of everybody, of what they think they're doing and what they think somebody else is doing. That is invaluable at this stage of a plan development, because I guarantee you there's going to be a whole bunch of, well, I thought you were doing that, or I thought that's something ambulance did. And we'll hopefully dispel a lot of that quickly now, or so that we can deconflict it now. And then we're going to try to identify where those gaps exist, and the gaps are good things, because we want to know about them now at this stage in the process so that we can take it and then start really influencing that in the plan we develop. And then we'll wrap this up by discussing the next steps. So where do we take this process? And I'll probably obviously turn that back to Jennifer to walk through where she see the program, the municipality going from there. Okay? So with that said, is there any other questions as I tap dance waiting for the RCMP to show up? No? Okay. All right. So we're going to start just because there are, and this is probably for Rob and I, and possibly for our ANBC colleagues, a bit of, let's just situate ourselves to the ground that is Bowen Island. So we can talk through some key things that speak to evacuation planning and why they're important. And we're also going to ask Emma to come up and talk very specifically to her piece. She'll kill it, I know it. So obviously this is just using some of Bowen's GIS mapping materials. This is the individual neighborhoods as they're broken up and on Bowen Island. This does not represent evacuation zones, and at the moment Bowen Island has not identified evacuation zones, as most municipalities tend to do eventually. Where if you want to evacuate a part of the island, you've already got a pre-identified zone. It becomes easier to issue an order for a zone to evacuate or give an alert to a zone versus trying to do it all by, okay, by the east boundary here and by this street and that type of thing sometimes becomes harder. Eventually there will be, as part of our process, recommended evacuation zones. Not as complicated as that, probably much more simplistic and based on geographic boundaries. But we recognize that within Bowen, you are an interesting community. You're the only island municipality. You've got a really interesting mixture of land use, and we'll show you what that looks like with other mapping. You have a very seasonal population. Rob and I have done similar processes for other kind of smaller communities on the mainland, Anmore and Belcarra, who also have very unique situations where they're a small residential year-round community that get a surge of up to 10,000 people a day to go use Bunsen Lake and Sassamat Lake. And it hugely overwhelms their ability to respond to something like that. That's a unique situation you have with also cabin dwellers that come in from the mainland to use their cabins as well as day visitors. You have variable density around the island. You know this better than I, where that density typically is, but we're going to talk about where that might be increasing and why we need to plan for that as well. There's a diversity in your population. And it was funny as we did our drive around today, and again, you're going to hear me make references to Anmore quite a bit, because there's a lot of interesting parallels to your communities. One is, like Anmore, you've got a long-term, multi-generational population on the island, and increasingly, you're getting a lot of new people coming to the island, particularly in the last 5 years, that are buying on the island, that have a different perception about what's expected from emergency management and support of that. So the longer-term multi-generation people, just like Anmore, they're self-sufficient. They don't require tons of support. They don't expect the municipality to have to do everything for them in the event of something going wrong. The trend with newer people to the island, and the very same thing in Anmore and Belcarra, is they expect the municipality to do everything for them. They are not as resilient. They aren't prepared to be as resilient. And that is also representing some of your seasonal cabin folks that come over and have a cabin here. They're not necessarily prepared to be prepared to hunker down for 2, 3, 4, 5 days at a time without a lot of support. Excellent.
Hi, Paula. Hi, Paula. You guys have enough seat for you?
Yeah, why don't you?
Should have kept undercover so I don't stand out.
Thank you for coming. Sorry, we all introduced ourselves. I think you know almost everyone. Mrs. Scott and Rob of Raesler Rescue Solutions. You were just taking us through the intro to the evacuation planning process.
Okay, good.
For what you want to repeat.
I'm going to go back to a real quick intro slide and just walk Paula through it. That's okay. So we've been brought in to help develop the evacuation plan for the municipality. What we're using today, I'll go back a couple of slides, is, here. This is going to be our rough agenda today. We're going to use this as a bit of a working group, and it's not intended to put you or the RCMP on the spot, but we are asking organizations to represent what are their rough plans that they already know of to put in place in support of an evacuation, either zonally or for the entire island. And we're just going to talk through that. So we've got reps from BC Ferry, BC Ambulances on speaker. Fire obviously represented by Kevin. And obviously key municipal players. And then to your right, we've got 2 reps from EMBC. So we've got a good representation here to have that discussion. And so when we get into it, the intent here is not to say you're not committing the RCMP or your detachment to anything. It's more of, for us, a fact-finding opportunity to use all of you guys at one time to learn about what we need to know, where the gaps exist, so that we can begin to start formulating the plan. And we'll be talking with you again several times to speak about specific issues, and that's where obviously, ideally, you can be maybe a bit more frank than you might be able to here, depending on the policy of the force. And we dealt with a lot of this planning in other municipalities where we've dealt with RCMP and members about what you're thinking about and whatever. So we're not trying to commit you to, and the RCMP is committing to absolutely nothing by anything you say here today. It's just allowing us to identify where gaps exist so that we can start real planning and know what we don't know, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Okay, so to step back then into our kind of intro is I really kind of ended on the fact that there's a variation of resiliency within the population here. Those are the key things that we've really identified within the island community. It's very unique. And your diversity of population come this summer is that your numbers can expand significantly with day trippers and people that come to visit their cabins and cottages from, say, the winter months where you have your year-round population that's a lot smaller during the week, maybe expands on weekends as people come to their cottages and the like. But because of that, that puts a strain, particularly in the peak of the summer months, on the ability of the island to respond to any emergency. And no doubt, I'm sure maxes out your detachment, it maxes out the volunteer fire department, just constant calls and incidents in the summer months. But that is also when we are at the peak of fire season. And fire season, realistically, the one thing we also highlighted was the expectation of evacuation is really driven by the risk of fire season, more so than any other threat. Outside of small evacuation of a single house fire that evacuates a building, a home, maybe a small part of a neighborhood, but we're talking interface fire that might lead to a large evacuation of entire portions of the island. So with that in mind, one of the key things we talked about for internal evacuation before we start getting on boats and fleeing the island is that obviously moving people around the island, you have a limited set of transport nodes around the island, and I'm going to ask if Emma can speak to them a bit, please. Just your general knowledge of, again, not in finite detail. The key routes, what are the limitations and challenges of some of those routes as you understand them? Where do we see choke points that we're concerned about, that broad stuff, just for those that are uninitiated?
It's definitely putting me on the spot.
But you're going to kill it. Can I hand you the laser pointer?
And it's mostly for people that aren't from Bowen. I mean, it's pretty straightforward. If you live on the island, you're aware of what the major routes are.
Just the green button.
All right. Actually, I think you can make out what the main routes are based on the thickness of the lines. Our main roads, the trunk road is the thickest one, and then the main road is the second thickest. And as you can see, as we mentioned, there aren't a lot of main routes. We have our main road going across the island east-west, and then another road going down to Cowan, Blue Water, Eagle Cliff, and Mount Gardner. We don't have a ring road. And our main point off the island is the Snug Cove Terminal. We have another one, Mount Gardner, as a municipal dock, and no ferry landing really here or here, but a barge can fit in Penstall Bay. We have a couple helipad landings. I'm not sure if the emergency one is even up yet. What else? I think that's all I can really think of. We
When you
don't
say-
have a lot of options.
When you say a barge can come, is there an actual physical structure there?
No.
No?
Just
It's
a
just-
boat launch.
Okay,
Big
so
enough.
I couldn't dock anything
A
there.
whole boat.
Okay.
Where are
Was
the
that about it?
Where are the helipads? There's one around the golf course?
So we're trying to work on getting a spot for BC Ambulance to land at night at the golf course. Currently BC Ambulance lands during the day at Kirkland Park in Snug Cove. And there's obviously a Coast Guard helipad on Radar Hill. So those are the ones I know about.
I'm not very.
Yeah,
And
one
what
of
they're
Everett.
talking about.
Yeah, somewhere.
Where we have not super useful to
Not-
evacuate.
Yeah.
And I guess when we're talking about choke points, there were a couple identified when we were going through our road network. I think everyone's familiar with the bridge off Carter, which I guess is smushed up in here somewhere. It's a single lane bridge that needs to be replaced, and there's a weight restriction on it right now, so things like the buses and community shuttles can't cross it. There's a similar crossing Cape Rogers, I think, around here. This is actually a private road, DC road, that can only be used in an emergency, but it is paved. Oh, and Bishop's Hill is also restricted access because it's just very dangerous right now.
Can you speak to any, regular day where you see the biggest traffic congestion points at junctions? That obviously would be something exacerbated by any evacuation.
This would probably be our busiest intersection by far. I think these points here, that's Kate's Hill Road coming on to Grafton, and Sunset, Bowen Bay area here. But really, Kevin probably could speak better to road congestion.
No, that's probably, the code would be the worst. I know what about Grafton.
And that's just on a daily basis, and it's driven, and is the primary driver for that typically coming from or going to ferry connection?
Yeah.
Is there anything
ferry
else?
unloading and stuff that stops everything and trying to turn, and there's big lamps behind people wanting to turn if there is unloading or
Right,
loading.
so something that sort of happen when a ferry is actually docking or about to dock, you're already gonna have potential congestion
Yeah.
in one of those key junction points. Okay, anything from your point?
No, I agree. That's what we're seeing, getting most of our complaints.
How is the school, like right at the school, because that used to be a problem when there were no buses, but I think on Fridays, but I think now with the buses, has that been alleviated? Because that would be pretty congested at times when
Let's do that drop off and pick up.
the pickups.
Okay. So we're not trying to beat this to death either, but what we're just trying to highlight here for us to just, we came with similar deductions, but it's useful to hear it. There is a couple of interesting routes that you've got that are closed off normally. Partly one's relatively dangerous and one it's cut off as a regular route. Now you've got the bridge. So you've got limitations on the routes you can use. And clearly one of the core deductions that becomes a challenge from an RCMP planning perspective is the issue of how do we maintain routes, route clearance, and particularly junctions being kept open for flow through of traffic. So in any scenario that we're talking about here, that is going to be probably the biggest issue. And the next biggest issue is going to be parking in relation to when we get to things like muster stations, which we'll talk about. What do you do with all the cars that arrive? Because there's only one place that can take cars off the island. If they're cut off by safe fire and cars move to a coastal zone, what are we doing with all those cars? Where can we put them without necessarily blocking the roads themselves? So these are things we'll talk through a bit as we go along. Don't expect any final solutions to it, but something just to keep in the back of our minds as we're talking our way through it. Okay. All right. This is a useful graphic to put up because it speaks to the basically expected population growth on the island itself. We see where the clear zones are of population on the island. And they're represented really where there are areas that you can't put houses that aren't on the top of mountains effectively, right? And where you see that kind of growth. You see obviously 2016, that growth, we're seeing a lot of this congestion, right? Obviously in these areas, right? A lot of residential congestion, but more importantly, I'm looking at that 2013 estimated. We're seeing the potential of quite a bit of housing congestion right here in an area that hadn't initially been anticipated, that runs right along your main artery, your east-west artery that will need to be planned for. A little bit of expansion, obviously, in the other areas, but again, a lot of it on the coastal ranges of the island. The challenge being, as Emma described, there's no ring road here, right? The island wasn't designed that way, and the terrain doesn't allow necessarily for a ring road either. So what you have here is that to get around, as we did when we did our drive around, is you're having to start, stop, and then go back, and that will become something that we'll need to be thinking about when it comes to route maintenance, route planning, and particularly when we design zones for evacuation, and early warning as much as possible so people are aware of some of those challenges.
What is the current population?
3,600.
3,600? And then in the summer it expands to like 5,000?
There are roughly 15,000 summer residents. 1,500. Sorry, 1,500 summer residents. And then day visitors, I don't know if we have exact data on that, but in the neighborhood of thousands in the summer, potentially.
Oh yeah, for sure.
I thought you were surprised.
Yeah, if it's a sunny day, you got thousands, yeah, for sure.
And one thing, Scott, I'm curious about from your perspective as the main carrier of people to and from the island. Do you have stats that we might be able to tap into that would speak a bit to the volume of number of boats you have to lay on, how many people you're physically taking to and from on a daily, like by season?
Yeah, we could get into that, dig into a bit.
Yeah, I mean, I don't expect
Just
you to
how many passengers you're going across. Yeah, you'd have to give me a timeline and I can break it down.
So don't expect to do it today, but if we can get that information, I think that'll be very, very significant, and we'll talk obviously a bit more offline about that. Okay, so we just put this up as saying this is a planning consideration when we're talking about the evacuation plan. We are recognizing this piece, and obviously what does that mean for the island? You're not going to be changing a lot of the infrastructure on the island in the sense of docks. What you've got is what you've got. You're not really enhancing them in any significant way. What you've got is a whole mixture of private and public docks that can take different vessels of different sizes. And there's more work going on about that. But this is just for our planning considerations. Okay. Interesting enough, if you overlay the interface fire risk, effectively the white space is simply mountains because there's nothing there. There's no interface with actual structures. what you have here is effectively, it's not so much interface, it's, what's the term? Intermix. So basically the forest is surrounding your entire community. It's not like an Anmore as an example, where the forest comes up to the edge of the community and then the community starts. That's traditional interface. This is intermix, where the community is entirely embedded within the forest around the community. So the actual separation between the volunteer fire department and structure protection and what BC Wildfire Branch is doing to basically attack fires are not as clearly cut in many ways as they are in a community like Fort Moody or Anmore, where it's pretty clear where the forest stops and where the community starts, so where the division of labor comes into fighting that fire. So this means, therefore, that the entire community is potentially affected by this fire risk, and therefore the zones need to reflect that. Here's a list of where you have reception centers, your ESS reception centers, that potentially can absorb displaced persons, internally displaced persons on the island. We see, obviously, and you guys know this, but for the uninitiated, the big clustering of them here around the cove, and then you've got one really on the southwest corner of the island and one in the northwest corner of the island. None of these centers are significantly large in the sense that they could absorb hundreds of displaced persons. In many cases, we're talking about they can take 20, 30 people. So while very useful from an ESS, your typical day-to-day ESS requirement where we've got a house fire or people are displaced by some kind of small event, and you're talking 2 families or 3 families, initially these things help you. But from the larger response, this becomes some of our challenges that we also have to take into consideration. Yes, sir.
Why isn't the school included in this?
It is.
Pardon?
It is.
Number 2.
Number 2. BI Community School.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No problem.
It's hard to see the roads.
Yeah, it's just hard, obviously, just with the nature of the mapping here. So the school definitely is probably your biggest resource. Big gym, big open field, generally pretty decent parking. The challenge obviously is, though, you can't really utilize the school during functional school hours when you've got kids in it. You can't do that mix, and the school board will not buy into that unless school shuts and they evacuate the school. So that becomes one of those things that becomes more challenging when school is in session. Okay. Hence why we also will probably look to engage School District 45 at our next planning session as well, so that, because they have very comprehensive plans of their own internal evacuation, and then making sure that we're fully in sync and they're in sync with how the site might be used. Okay, and then finally we have muster and evacuation zones. These are separate from reception centers where internally displaced people would be. These are in the event of an evacuation of the island, from the island to the mainland in some capacity. So this is making your way to a water egress point, mustering there in a central location where people can be accounted for, people with mobility concerns can be identified, and they can be then moved to a dock to actually be evacuated. Obviously, Snug Cove is your main one. You're going to always use that as your primary because it can take the most people. It has the most infrastructure to be able to absorb the flow through of people, and it's the only one where cars can leave the island. The remainder of them are basically people being evacuated without their vehicles, and honestly, with probably limited things on their person, just because of the nature and the size of the boats that can go in there. Sorry, I'm having a bit of a fart here. Sorry, I keep forgetting your name. Bruce, pardon me. Bruce has done some fantastic work on this study. This is not complete, and he's actually doing greater detail, water-based survey of this, so that we have actually much more accurate information. I very much appreciate all of that effort, because that will be invaluable to what we can do here, because it also speaks to the nature of ships or vessels that can get into these docks, how many people they typically can take, what is the potential communications capability at each one of these locations and at the muster stations, what kind of cell coverage do they have, etc. And this will be invaluable to the work that we put into place. The thing to remember in any one of these, though, outside of the main ferry terminal, that any evacuation from these locations is going to require a lot of support in the sense of traffic control once they get there, control of the muster station once they arrive, particularly separating people from vehicles so that the vehicles aren't blocking roads, and then assisting those with any mobility challenges or other requirements to be able to get down to the jetty to actually get on a boat. And that's typically if they're cut off from one of the primary egress points like Snug Cove, because of the fact of fire, say, cutting off their access point to the road itself being cut off for whatever reason. Those are things that we're going to be wanting to think about and plan about, but they require people to assist them, and that's something we're also going to talk about a little bit more significantly when we get into our discussions. Okay. So that's my broad intro, and hopefully I'll be doing a little less talking at you guys, and we're now going to start hearing from you guys a bit more. I wanted to lay out those other pieces, partly for myself and Rob, really, to do a lot of learning. For others that are here, colleague Scott, you know, to have a better understanding of some of the challenges on the island. He knows the ferries better than anybody, but he doesn't necessarily understand some of the challenges that might be coming to the ferries that his folks are going to have to deal with. That's why we kind of went through that pre-piece. And also to everybody understand we're now on a common sheet of general understanding. Was there anything I missed that you think we should be thinking about in regards to those types of issues before we move on?
What about essential services might need to come this way? So we'd be sending those over, right, like fire trucks or backhoes, depending on what the emergency is.
Exactly.
Getting them to where they need to be if you've got the arteries all clogged up on your main street here.
And that's
because I noticed it's backed up a lot, right? Like
that. No, and that's an excellent point. So obviously our focus initially has been evacuation of the people from the island, but you're absolutely right. It's a two-way street. And in dealing with that issue, you're going to be potentially getting additional responders and apparatus coming from the mainland, coming here, and then evacuees going out on the same boats and then doing a shuttle like that. So we'll definitely talk more about that in greater detail. Okay. But thank you for that. Yes.
So I totally understand that people are the first priority, but there are some people with livestock that are gonna stay home if they can't get their livestock out, so.
So I would ask that when we talk about things like capability and other pieces of that, let's have that discussion about what is it, what capability do we have and not. We were having a discussion, Jennifer and I, earlier today, acknowledging that Minister of Agriculture only deals with professional farms. Commercial farms, the term I'm looking for. Hobby farms, they do not provide support to. Hobby farms are then a problem with the municipality. So this is something that we absolutely want to talk through and identify what those challenges are going to be and how might we potentially address them. Absolutely, thank you for that.
Speaking more to what Scott was talking about, logistically getting supplies on and off the island, thinking about, for instance, the North Shore talks about using a pod system. And in other words, getting materials in and out logistically so that they are usable when they get here, rather than sending small pieces that are unprotected, for instance. So I think it's important that when foodstuffs, et cetera, start coming over here, emergency supplies, that they are in, that there is some sort of safe method of transporting it, so we don't have a lot of spoilage. You know, entering the island system.
Right, so that if I can kind of summarize a bit of what I'm hearing from you is that the typical logistics chain is just-in-time delivery with the expectation they're taking whatever's in that refrigerated truck and they're dropping it somewhere that's going to have the capacity to absorb that.
Yeah.
And we're saying that in some of the scenarios for internal evacuation where power might be an issue and other challenges, we might need to consider that as one of those requests.
And fuel.
And the other piece, that I did mention was we understand limited fuel stocks on the island at any given time. They're generally, positively, sometimes centrally located. But if that becomes cut off from other parts of the island, whatever you might have in your own internal fuel stocks become a challenge.
And what is the safest way to transport fuel in that type of quantity?
Right, and we can talk a bit about, I'm sure Scott can speak a bit to the dangerous goods piece, a little bit of just about transport issues and how do we work that, because right now, as an example today, we understood why I'm not leaving at certain times, because it's a dangerous goods fair.
If fuel and large amounts like that coming over, we can't have passengers on there as well.
Exactly.
So there's flash points and everything. That's why you have a dangerous goods sailing that comes over here every Wednesday. So we'd have to arrange that that's all that's coming over is the truck with whoever's driving it,
right,
and the crew.
Right, and so those are definitely considerations we want to build in. And how does that affect the kind of thing that you might be thinking of in regards to your plan to support something here, if that is going on?
There's another side of that too, is that if the infrastructure for the ferries is broken down, where is the secondary infrastructure, you know, for food, fuel, et cetera. So. Okay. Good things to keep.
And I recognize the one thing we don't really have representation here is about commercial barges. We don't really have someone, unless you can.
Yeah, we barge fuel over all the time.
Then I'll let you speak to that in much more detail.
The fuel guy does.
But how we do that and how does that work in regards to, say, if is there damage to ferry infrastructure and its ability to assist, or is that the way we deal with it so we don't have cross or lose sailings to evacuate people and vehicles and move other hazardous materials by other means?
Yeah, he uses Tunstall Bay boat launch.
Okay.
He has to bring gas over with, so he can't always use on dangerous cargo, so he needs more fuel. He'll just barge it over to Tunstall Bay.
Okay. And so as an example then, those arrangements and standing agreements with the companies to provide you support, how robust are those, the barge companies?
Well, one's local,
Okay.
Based on
based on Bowen, yeah, so
Okay.
he just deals with the gas station,
Okay.
with Ian.
So we'd be probably interested to talk with you a little bit more to get a better understanding of the capacity of what that local barge company can do and move, and then what other contracts you might also have.
Okay.
Okay. Awesome. Any other questions? I thought I saw. No? Okay. So with that in mind, let's move into some hearing a bit more from your guys' perspective from the when you're representing ESS, as an example, you got a kind of an emergency hat and then a regular municipal hat. Obviously, I'm interested in an emergency hat today. What I'm interested in is finding out, your organization, even internally, do you have an existing plan to deal with evacuations, specific to how, even if it's just a standard operating procedure, I'm interested in knowing roughly what that is and what are the key pieces of it, what you can recount. I don't expect tons of detail. We can follow up with the detail afterwards for sure. What I'd then like to understand is, in support of an evacuation, what does your organization, external or internal, bring to the table to support an evacuation here in Bowen, just so we all have a rough understanding of what that would be. And then we can identify where there might be some gaps, more probably near the end, where we've identified that we've got tons of barge and we've got good ferry, but we don't have a lot of this, we don't have a lot of this. That's what we're going to try to identify early on so that we can start working and solving some of those solutions. And I would argue a gap right away during evacuation, not a gap that's a negative because of how they're staffed, but the RCP being a good example, in any community we work in, there's never enough members to affect large-scale evacuation of what the permanent establishment is of that detachment, because it's not designed day to day to do that. But it has the ability to be surged. So we're going to talk a bit about kind of what those things are and what's the timelines it takes to surge members, say as an example, if that was to happen. Not to put you on the spot at all.
Well, we got 3 members, we got it covered.
Right. and I go back to the Anmore example. Anmore's the exact same way. It's got 3 members from its rural division, but it has the benefit of being, those members are basically dispatched out of Coquitlam detachment. So they already have an agreement to have significant numbers from Coquitlam detachment to easily back them up if it was needed. You've got the time and space issue here that becomes a bit more challenging, right? And that's something we'll just want to talk through. So with that in mind, why don't we, in no particular order, really just go around the table. We'll start a bit with Jen, so I want to put her back on the hot seat since she put me on the hot seat. To quickly talk through what that is, and then we'll go around the table.
So we have an emergency management plan. We have, in terms of capabilities, trained EOC staff. We have emergency operations centers. They have backup power. We have EMBC's evacuation operational guidelines. The staff have a knowledge and understanding of how to legally declare a state of local emergency, how to effect an evacuation. They know the difference between evacuation alert and order. We've tried to do some public education to the community with regards to the different types of evacuation. In terms of gaps, there's still a lot of learning to be done. I don't think staff are confident that they could do this if certain key players weren't here. I think that we would struggle with a lack in terms of numbers if this were, because most of our staff also live on the island, if this were affecting them as individuals, then that might make it challenging for them to report to work. So, and then of course we don't have a specific evacuation plan, which is a gap we're working on.
Need somebody to build that.
Did I miss? I'm sure there's lots more I could say.
No. I mean,
It's just sort of
honestly, we're skimming the surface here today. But even the stuff we're going to bring out, skimming the surface, but with everybody in the room to hear it, is going to be invaluable when we get together again and we start building on this and building on this. And we show up with much more of a framework of something that you're given ahead of time to then discuss and take it to the next step. So this is perfect.
So I feel like we're sort of putting Edward on the spot as the next person going here, because he's new to his role.
Okay.
And the group that you're organizing are informally organized at this stage and
Yeah.
just being sort of reinvented. So you can speak to sort of what you think it'll look like if that's easier.
Yeah, you sent out an email on the 28th of May. There were 72 NERPs who had volunteered earlier. We've heard back from 14, 8 of them are saying no. So major gap right now is that we really don't have a real clear idea of neighborhood emergency response personnel. And, you know, hopefully as we move through the summer and into the fall, that gap will be diminished. But I was surprised at actually the lack of response. So we've got a lot of work to do.
But once that program is functioning better or like it used to, I think there's a real role for those neighborhood people in an evacuation.
And I'm just curious what your thoughts are, so about what do you think their role could be from your
Well,
perspective? I know you're new.
Yeah, well, no, first, it's just being in contact with the neighborhood, letting everybody know what's going on as best as they can, so there's a kind of a collective understanding. Secondly, people have resources, chainsaws, generators, you know, are people, boats, are people willing to share those in case of an emergency? And there's people in the neighborhood have specific skills, first aid skills, things like that. You know, being able to use a big chainsaw and get a log out of the road. So that's one of the things we hope to understand too, is who's in the neighborhood, what are their needs, young children, older people with disabilities, and what can they add to the solution? Skills, equipment, et cetera, et cetera.
I think that from our perspective, and we had a lot of discussions around this, that is critical information for the Emergency Operations Center to be able to function with, to make informed decisions about whether it be external requests from the mainland coming over to support, what the individual team leaders here might need to know to help do their jobs, but that also can be a gigantic enabler from the point of view of what individual neighborhoods might be able to do to facilitate in preparation for their own other evacuation, or acting as an information node to pass information and also to keep people calm.
Yes.
So I think what we're doing here is a huge enabler for this, and I think it's going to be a fantastic program when it gets going. And you're saying you're brand new or newish in the position?
Started around end of May.
So you're a veteran, okay? So you're still at the very early stages of truly identifying who your volunteers might be.
And basically, we're doing an assessment, who's interested.
Right.
And the interest level does not appear to be that high at the moment.
Have you guys engaged the water taxis like Comrant and Mercury and see,
Right.
because Comrant, yep, we have.
No.
They can move people too, right? We use them all the time.
Right.
Right.
To move, if we have a problem with a vessel or something's going on, we'll start shuttling water taxis.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they're an excellent resource.
They're not at the table today, but they'll be engaged.
They
I've
will,
already
okay.
started a list of not just Bowen-based operators, but anyone in Half Sound. And I'm going to try and understand what their capacity is, contact information, that sort of thing, including.
Yeah. So the benefit being, if it's an island-specific event, fires just on the island, we'll have access to lots of those potential resources. If it's something that's affecting here in parts of the mainland and just the water course in general, then it becomes more challenging to know what's out there available for sure. Okay.
Can I jump in, because I was helping with
Yeah.
the NERPs and we'll chat afterwards. One of the visions I had, it was exactly what you just said, was that it was a note, like an information note. And so just depending on exactly what the emergency circumstance is, and this is with Bruce and communications as well, is that if communications have broken down for some reason, that NERP person or NERP hub or whatever it is in the neighborhood will be that, hopefully with radio communication, will be that connection for the municipality to those neighborhoods if, say, they're physically cut off because of the roads or something. So that's like another thing that I'm hoping that program can achieve.
Okay. So, and we've definitely captured that piece, and we'll look to explore more about that. Is there written terms of reference for it? Oh,
Just another thing with the NERPs, it would save us a lot of time. If your NERPs are letting public works know that, hey, our roads are open, I don't have to send a whole crew to the other side of the island, and the roads are totally fine.
Yeah.
Just wasting all that time where it could be
Yeah.
used somewhere else.
So it's, I mean, we're definitely taking away the possibility of a communication zone, ability to find neighborhood-related information well ahead of the event, and also then potentially additional eyes and ears for both the detachment and for yourself if in the event that they need to identify it without putting themselves at risk, which is obviously the key element.
There are no formal terms of reference, but the website does have a page that outlines their responsibilities.
Okay. So we'll probably speak a bit offline about some of your thoughts on that and what we're going to do. So, great. Okay. Well, for just doing it new, great. And I think it's a fantastic program. I think it's you know, they talk about programs like this, obviously in bigger municipal zones, they're just not as effective. You can't maintain them, you can't manage them, but in a community like this, I'd argue they are manageable.
You mentioned one thing at the beginning about resiliency. Neighborhoods are shifting. 15 years ago, I would say our neighborhood was pretty self-sufficient, self-reliant, kind of tough. Now, not so much. You know, we talk about, for some people it's fire smart, but for other people it's fire scared. So, you know, there's issues that we have to be able to manage that way also.
Okay, thanks, Rich. Awesome. So, are you guys going to do a collective?
Well, just for me as a municipal employee, I'm trained to work in the EOC, and as a volunteer, I'm trained to work with ESS.
Okay.
So basically, in an emergency, our CAO will send me to one of those places, I'm sure.
The greatest need to see.
The gap that I see is that I have lots of training in both and zero experience. So for me, that's a bit of a gap. I would love to be deployed so I can actually see how they function. And as far as ESS goes, ESS specifically.
So the ESS program is providing short-term relief for evacuees, whether it's large or small. Usually 72 hours, but it can go longer than that. We have a call-out system that we would call our volunteers to attend after we get the EOC opened up, to go to one of the reception centers. And like a lot of the programs, we don't have a lot of volunteers, so that's going to be our biggest challenge.
How many do you think you have in any given activation?
I would say we'd get 7 or 8
Okay.
at a reception center, and then of course we'd have walk-in people that we'd have to be training, but that would be a huge, you know, challenge because, you know, we've only got so many to work with the evacuees coming in.
How many do you think you have trained right now on the total that might be able to be called on?
15? Yeah, a dozen, 15.
And so that's where you kind of got that figure from, that, okay, I know if a call out went, we would be typical, we would get 7 if we needed 7.
Yeah, hopefully, yeah.
But it'd be difficult to get more than that. Sure.
350.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
a relatively, I mean, it's an understandable capacity for an ESS, for a day-to-day ESS structure for a municipality this size, for sure.
Yeah.
So what the gap then potentially is that if we had to do multiple reception centers, locations, your staff would get tapped out, your volunteers would get tapped out.
Definitely. We'd have to be bringing somebody in from the North Shore for sure.
Right, and you don't really have the capacity to run training in the event, so there might be a deduction to come out of that to be thinking about prior, doing our best to increase at least awareness and training, although that's difficult because people have to self-identify.
Yeah. We also have, we work on having people prepared. I'm still selling emergency kits. You know, we have been for the last 3 or 4 years.
Right.
So that's a big one for me, to get people prepared for, you know, 72 hours for that.
To help them build a bit more resiliency in place, idea. Okay.
And we also have on board now CDART, the Canadian Disaster Animal Response Team.
Okay.
So they are setting up their program in the different neighborhoods on the island.
Okay.
And they will have different neighborhoods and head people that they will be looking after the animals in those areas.
Okay.
So that's a benefit to the emergency, the ESS program.
Okay, is that operated by someone here on the island as well? program? Or are you owning it as
The
well?
Canadian, the CDART program is Canada-wide, and we have a chapter now on Bowen.
Okay, and, but that's not, you're not acting as part of that chapter, you just know of it?
No, they are a separate chapter, and we call on them to
Okay.
run our pet services in the event of an emergency and opening a reception center.
Okay, obviously, we're good.
But yeah, those volunteers are based on Bowen.
Yeah, okay, that'd be great. Yeah, we definitely like to know a bit more about that. And I acknowledge everything you described about the challenge with pet owners. Pet owners aren't often a challenge if they've got their own vehicles and the pet is effectively a dog or a cat. When you suddenly get, I got 2 llamas and I got this or that, and I don't have the ability to transport them, that becomes then the bigger challenge. And therefore, a lot of what we're thinking about now is about warning and advance notice to be able to provide some relocation or temporary relocation of some of those animals, and how do we do that? And this group might be able to assist with a lot of the technical.
Yeah, we do have a program that we have an evacuation form that people have filled out, so that in the event of emergency, we may have to move my farm over to the east end
Okay.
at Miller's farm, right? And
Gotcha.
we have that in place.
Okay, so you already have arrangements between those that have larger parcels that might be able to accept that?
Yep.
Okay, excellent. So I'd love to build us some access to what that looks like and all that, because we definitely want to incorporate that as something that's part of it. Yeah. Okay, that sounds actually great. I like that. I like the idea of the farm owners assisting and providing that immediate support as opposed to the entire expectation that become a municipality issue. But that's good. Okay. Anything else?
Just awareness, just out there all the time, telling people to be prepared,
Okay. Well, that's the best thing you can do.
help out.
All right.
I think my main contribution is at the planning stage. I'm not even sure if I'd be on the island, I don't live on the island. But I do help support the planning efforts with land use knowledge, transportation, development and growth on the island, basic GIS.
Can you speak a little bit to the updating of the system that's been taking place up until this point to prepare for this plan?
Yeah, so I think you're referring to the GIS data that we have. I think about a year ago we completed a cadastral update. Our cadastral, which is the property lines, were quite off by up to 15 meters in some places on the island, which really wouldn't help any planning efforts. So it's been enhanced to within, I believe, half a meter from most of the island. So the cadastral we have right now should be good. Our transportation network was also just very recently improved. It was created in the field one segment at a time, and it was never properly entered into the database as a road network. So things like network analysis or shortest path analysis, things like if you think of Google Maps, getting an address from getting from A to B was not possible with our data because it was never a connected network. But we've just gotten it fixed recently, so it is a network now. I think those are the two main things.
So, if I can, so what are some of the products that will come out of that process that can be used, say, an example, by the Emergency Operations Center in an evacuation scenario? How might they use some of that new product?
In real time, you would need to have a GIS technician or someone with GIS knowledge and expertise to actually run analysis in real time. But I think given our fairly limited road network, you could probably predict the main areas that might be impacted and do that analysis ahead of time to determine best evacuation routes.
Okay. Yeah, so I think that's probably a key takeaway. In the pre-planning you were describing, that I don't think we would need as much of that in real time, just given we're not talking huge distances per se, but if you've got planning factors that have already been identified in the process you're talking about, I think that would be hugely beneficial for what an EOC might have in planning considerations. Okay, thank you. And now a big one.
So we have a lot of ship-to-shore evacuation plans in place, which is basically a ship that's, something happens on the vessel.
Okay.
And we need to offload them. So we have plans for that, but in terms of how can you evacuate the island, we'd shut down services immediately
Okay.
for passengers. We have one vessel that can come into here, it's the Queen of Capilano. Take 457 people, that's including 12 staff. That's based on the number of staff, to how many people are on there in case an emergency happens while it's out at sea. So,
Is that more than usual?
no,
Or
that's
it's just-
Transport Canada regulated. If that was to be changed, we'd have to get buy-off on that through Transport Canada and the superintendent. Everything goes through an operations security center, so there's an OSC, which is based out of Victoria. It's 24/7. They deal with essential services. They have direct lines to pretty much anyone we need to talk to. So they usually, right now, the incident commander on our side would be the manager or the superintendent, whoever's there. But they're looking at going to a model now where the actual OSC becomes the incident commander.
For your management of the incident?
For all of BC ferries, yeah. So they're 24/7.
Okay.
You know, if the infrastructure is in any way damaged here, we wouldn't be able to come into the dock. If it's just a loss of power, we could run off ship power, so we could run the ramps off ship power.
Okay.
The other vessels won't come in here, the bigger vessels, the Oak Bay, and they're too big.
Okay. And I'm a complete novice. I'm assuming
Yeah.
that there's no ability
It's a depth.
to transfer something to a larger vessel.
No, it's the
you guys need full
water
ramps?
depth, and the actual dock here is just, it won't accept those vessels.
Okay. So you've got the one vessel.
We got
you guys can use.
one vessel that go into shuttle mode, so we basically just go to shuttle mode and go back and forth as required.
Okay.
Essential services would be able to come over if you needed anything brought over here.
Okay.
Basically just 100 vehicles can go on there as well.
Right.
100 cars, so the equivalent if you're bringing bigger stuff over, that's gonna drop that down.
And the shuttle time, is there any practical way of speeding that up, or is that's the time it takes?
They can probably make the crossing in about 18 minutes. If they really put the, throttle to full down.
So
Then depends if you have a slow bell coming in here, you might have a slow bell, which means they have to come into the dock slower. In emergencies, or if you're ever working on docks here, they have what's called a slow bell. So that adds probably another 2 or 3 minutes to that crossing. They just gotta slow down when they come into the dock, just for precaution.
Okay.
There was some discussion in a different forum about the amount of time that it takes to load cars, and the thought was that perhaps we wouldn't load any cars in order to load the ferry faster.
Yeah.
Is that true?
We could do that. Well, if you don't want cars going over, we could take just passengers. It doesn't increase the capability of how many people can go on there, because that's based on the crew and Transport Canada.
Right. So I mean so
That's a set number for now, yeah.
The max numbers won't change. It's just what it will be with the number of people versus
Turnaround
the
time.
vehicles. And turnaround time.
Yeah, anytime you're loading foot passengers and you don't have walkways, it's slow. So if you got 500 people walking on there, it's gonna be faster than loading 100 cars. We have it with Langdale right now, and we find there's no overhead ramp there, and foot passengers walking off. Some people have walkers, some people have strollers. It all depends what's going on there.
Right. Yeah. For
Turnaround time, I would assume would be pretty similar. Get them all on there. You have nothing coming off though, you gotta think too. If there's nothing coming off, you don't have to take any traffic off of there, so you could probably load it up in 10 minutes, going through all the proper
You just
procedures.
have to think of the bottleneck of traffic, because your roads are limited, right? So people are gonna drive to the docks, where they're gonna leave their cars. And you have people walking and abandoning the cars. Are you gonna move those cars? What are you gonna do with them? So that might be a bigger challenge.
We're gonna talk a bit about that with Public Works.
Yeah, we're staging those people to make sure that there's not more than 500, right? Counting those people, if people are in a panic and they're lined up. So I go with, what we use is some kind of a card for if we're evacuating a vessel. Everyone coming off, we have a plan where ramp attendants or terminal staff are basically on that ramp, and as they come off, every single person gets a card. Child, dog, everybody gets a card, and then there's a muster station for them.
Right.
So I think you'd almost have something with them going on. We'd have to physically count them and have a way to stop so we don't get, stampede of 1,000 people on there, and the vessel won't leave. It'll sit there and it's gonna.
Right. And I
It's
think
gonna make things take a lot
and that's
longer,
one of the things
because
that
they
we
will
were-
not leave with more than 1,000 people.
Totally agree. And it's one of the things we were talking about is that, particularly for that, is how do we manage the flow of people down, as opposed to the day-to-day way it does, where people are used to it, they all line up, block the road basically, and, or not block the road, there's roads past it, but they basically kind of fall into line with how they normally do it. This would require a new normal with much more positive control, I would argue, to ensure that the numbers that actually get there and it is control, it's a movement control point, that basically even before they get to you.
Yeah.
So there's dual sets of counts to make sure that there's not too many people that slows the boat up. And Jennifer, when we were talking, was also highlighting that there's advantages if you can do this in a staged way, where you've got warning time to get people with their vehicles off the island, because then they're much more self-sufficient on the other side, without us creating potentially an ESS challenge for West End, North Vancouver, because we've now got a whole bunch of people that don't have anything beyond their cockatoo and backpack. What do you do with them? So this is what we want to make them a much more, so there is definitely some thought to that, and how would we phase that in alerts and warnings to allow people to thin out in the event of something of a potential evacuation, so that when it does become much more of a crisis and they do go to foot traffic only, we're down to those that's the only option they have at that site or different sites. So it's a useful set of considerations. From the point of view of GAP, one more thing, point of view of GAP though, if that one ferry is out of service for whatever reason, is there any other option to draw from the fleet to fill that gap in an emergency?
You'd have to get something from Tawasin and brought over. There's vessels over there that could probably, I could talk to the marine superintendent and just see if they've been, sea tested and brought them over here.
Yeah.
If they'll actually fit in there. It would take a while to get that vessel here.
Have we used another one before, one of the other ones up?
Yeah, there's,
Further away.
yeah, it comes from even further away.
Oh,
You're talking
yes.
about the Island Sky.
I take it it's being used right now.
Bone Queen, there's about 4 or 5, there's Island Sky, there's the Bone
It's
Queen.
good to look at those options too.
How long would it take them to get from Boston, assuming it fits?
If they're in Tawasin, if they're not in retrofit or in a refit, I can find that out for you.
Yeah, I mean, useful just to understand what those planning considerations and factors are.
Because the staff, the captain and the crew would have to be cleared to come here as well. So they can't come into those docks unless they're cleared and gone through sea trials and everything else to come here. So the vessel may be able to come here, but then they also have to make sure they have the correct crew on that.
So you're gonna marry them up with the right crew to be able to come into it, and that's.
Yeah,
what
so
the factor-
usually the people who are on the Capilano are also cleared to go on the Island Sky.
Okay.
Or whatever other vessel comes in here when that one goes into retrofit.
Okay. Yeah, that'll be very useful.
It'd be a process, I'll have to look at getting a timeline for that.
Please.
I can talk to.
Yeah, I think we'd want to include that in the data material that we build into the plan, so that the EOC, as an example, can understand what that implication would be. And potentially, they might be able to be, if it's of extended duration, could one of those vessels be brought in addition to the existing one, to speed up possibility of evacuation with notice and everything else?
Then the other, like I said earlier, we use the water taxis, so if something happens during the day, we'll have to go to water taxis. If something unforeseen happens that wasn't,
Right.
so we can't bring cars over, we're just bringing people over until it gets resolved.
Right. So, okay. And sorry, Dave, what?
Is it possible to anchor a larger ferry farther out and shuttle people back and forth in Zodiacs and private boats?
No.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, and this.
That echoes what every one of your colleagues has said.
Yeah, well, I've asked, we've talked about it before, and I've gone back and I've talked to everyone all the way up the chain, and they've all said.
They're good at getting them off the ferries, but not so much from the water back on.
Water back on, yeah, because you have to use the DAVIT system, it adds another, serious potential for, takes time, but there's also potential, you put another risk in there, and more variability, and, yeah.
I was just gonna say one quick idea a few minutes ago. If there was some sort of mass evacuation of ferry, it would make sense to bring Metro Parks into the conversation and like the boat festival. Because that, to me, is where my mind went. If you've got hundreds of cars coming to the cove, that is one location. That would be a big parking lot, and people can walk from there.
It's always unlocked.
It's Metro Parks. You want to have that conversation.
Excellent, yes. And Metro Vancouver.
Yeah, the baseball field, yeah.
I've noticed that we're kind of an hour a bit into it. Why don't we take a quick 5-minute break before we kind of carry on? And, I don't know if there's coffee.
I'll grab coffee.
And, we'll take 5 minutes, stretch yourselves, and then we'll carry on then.
Yeah, I think we were pointing at
I'm glad you're here. If you have 5 minutes, you're in trouble, you're moving. Where are you going?
miss it. It's been great. I love working on it. This is part of like making a difference. I just had a reason I'm late. I was late. Is I had a meeting with Metro Parks liquor inspector and
For this
great thing. You guys, somebody's not using this yet. I'm not going to be a liquor. Sorry. I'm relaxed. I said, you can expand your liquor. If you expand it, then so well.
Conversation, so it's about anyone who's on the island.
We're coordinating.
Okay, yeah.
How's engineering?
Same. It's pretty much busy. Oh, no, it's good. Yeah, I'm working on a few projects, mostly on island, elsewhere. And then, like on this side of things, I'm still taking part in this at provincial level for this post-disaster building evaluation.
There's so much movement in our things changing.
It's twice a year. It was a little surprised to be keeping that conversation going.
Areas brand new.
Making sure we're all organized.
Are we gonna have
There's many overheatings that are.
Oh, yeah, so the house that's happening over there, not gonna be.
I know there's a rock dog.
Right, I saw that. Yeah.
It's gonna be,
Rock dogs,
but
yeah.
near you, like next to the fire hall.
DDS,
So we're gonna
rock
be.
dogs, yeah.
That's exciting.
It is, it's great, so the fire hall's there, and Miller's here, and you guys are here.
If you're
So the
looking
health center's gonna be
for
there, and then we're gonna be here.
ESS contacts at the EMBC,
That's
is
the
that
fire
what
hall.
Yeah,
The houses are here.
Yeah, so that's the house,
And
and
then
the
parking
parking
lot
lot.
here.
Yeah, and there's that
So
big
they're gonna be
rock,
just
there's gonna be
added?
big rock. Not added, just maintaining connections consistent. So there's like a trail right there that goes in to down to the ferry and everything.
Yeah,
And
so
then
Rob
there's
Dawes
a
is not
venue
necessarily
over
an
there.
ESS
When are you guys gonna
guy.
get back to
No,
nature?
he's a training guy,
Nothing.
training and
Just
exercise.
taking nature away. It's a pretty small site, like we're building a 24 unit apartment building, right? On
Put
a-
like beehives, bead.
I don't, I have no objections to like a little garden or beehives or something, yeah. There are quite a lot of beehives on
There's a lot of selling, like, for example, the baseball guys, they mentioned, like, is it possible to liquor trucks, is it possible for us to serve here and not have to put a cup plastic? Well, the reason they have a plastic cup is so people, they're not projectiles, right? But we don't have that problem.
Then you like
So I like that idea, because then if they sell it,
just
people
email
will
me
be
and I'll
like, yes,
forward you
you
along
guys are
wherever you
thinking
need.
socially and environmentally conscious, they're more likely to support that vision.
Yeah.
So little things like
It'd
that.
be interesting, I
For
don't,
me, I'm a
you know,
bit of a, especially for Bowen
just-
Islanders, and like,
Yeah.
you're putting in
point of interest, but it'd be interesting.
you know, we're getting something out of it
As opposed to 24 units of housing that people desperately need.
well, that, but I'm just saying, it's like a small effort to, you reach out to the bee people here and say,
Federal
hey,
regulations
it's a
would be
little spot
effective
for you,
if
so
there was
Yeah.
thing for it.
Yeah.
It's
a
just,
provincial debt.
for me not using that spot.
I wonder how many of those things could be
Yeah,
that's
waived,
what
or
I'm
the
gonna
one, the
benefit.
magic deck
Well,
one,
you
and
know,
say,
you
we're
know.
gonna put on more
Well, we
people.
have to watch out, because I spoke to somebody
I know, I
who's
just
interested
wonder,
in having
I've
bees.
gone down
We're
there.
gonna have to watch out, like, essentially bees kind of have an area, and so you don't actually want to have hives too close to each other, because then there's overlap.
I wonder what it is.
So like, so they mapped out
What
kind of on the island where the different things, and this
provincial
one happened to be like right in the crux of like 3 old existing hives, so they were like, no, you shouldn't have one, because then you're stealing their territory, right? And then actually making it worse than the other hives. So you gotta be careful here.
So we have our plans for our internal stuff.
T minus July 7th.
They can take over
July
that.
7th.
Yeah.
And so do you have a set
so
plan
imagine-
now of what
imagine
you're
just
doing and where you're going?
No.
You still, no, you're just going on?
Well, I have to work in North Van for a month
Or you
first.
have to work in North Vancouver?
And then,
Where are you guys based at? You guys are in.
and then Spain, and eventually Costa Rica.
It's not the worst, not the worst commute. I live downtown, so actually it's better coming this way.
The whole time.
Where, like a year?
Just about the same commute that we
For a
do.
year? Yeah.
Yeah, well, one
That's
was my sister's in Spain, right?
Right.
So we're gonna visit around there. We go to Slovakia, which is where my wife is from. Then from there, she wants to go to Portugal, maybe
usually like-
It's gonna
Slovenia.
be a building block for another one.
and that's
Hey, you
it.
should be saying that. I'm saying it's like
Come back
clockwork.
Here in
Like
November.
clockwork.
And go to Costa Rica. does get really
You never
hungry
know.
now.
Some days it is, some
And then
days
visit like,
Susan
you know,
starts getting hungry,
Colombia,
just calm down.
maybe
Usually
Nicaragua.
catch up in the afternoon.
Get to know family there.
If something happens in the morning.
I'm starting to really
All my
shut down.
family's over on the Sunshine Coast, so I'm
To shut down
used to
mentally.
the ferry. Just don't worry about it.
Yeah.
And if once I get to Oyster Bay, relax.
Yeah.
Oyster burgers, and things.
It's nerve-wracking, 24 hours a day with children.
That's kind of like 2 hours, because you're ready to get in trouble.
And somehow that's more nerve-wracking than walking around carrying a gun. Just the idea that my job requires me to carry a gun, I think, would mean more to me even than, and I don't have children and don't look at them.
Or they don't, my gun does not ask me what time it is, what are we doing now, like,
No, I
hungry.
know it doesn't. It's a
It's
different set of stress.
Left.
But it's exciting. It's a
And
good
really, you can
time to
walk a
just
child
stretch
into a
our
small
mind.
room if you really have to. You can just walk a child into a small room and go away for a minute.
See, no, in this day and age, it's called YouTube or Netflix.
Yeah, right, yeah. Well, I remember once babysitting my sister's daughter when she was, in this kind of age. And she screamed. My sister left the room and she started screaming, and she did not stop screaming for like an hour. And during that time, I remember the point of going, well, I could just drop it off the balcony. And I went, okay, let's not do that. So I lied down in the middle of the floor and went and made
Whereas the
dinner.
partridge should be on the opposite side when you come in that front. So they're having all kinds of consultations here.
Shut up.
There's a redevelopment.
Well, I've been all over it.
Yeah, that point is gone, it was it. Now she's lovely.
I like it when they're talking to you. Really the craziest.
Yeah.
That's when I start to.
That thing is barely wide enough for a wheelchair. And they've got the whole lower area.
Real
Do that fence right there.
Well, and this is exciting. I'm so glad you're on.
It's just the trouble
Oh, I know.
They used to actually, before they had the
Gatherings or events.
people used to go out and see some chicken on.
That's right.
Because I was.
Okay, folks, we're gonna get together in just one more minute, okay? 1 more minute.
Coffee from.
I wasn't gonna bring my wood.
So Mark's in, right behind the spot.
Oh, okay, thank you.
You got the email from Jen.
I apologize. I think I missed it. Are you sure doing it? You're in.
No.
You never know.
You might not be on the list because it's 3 years old, right?
Oh, yeah. I wasn't on it for you.
Yeah, I think so.
Well, that's Vancouver covers it too.
For some reason,
You're landlocked, there's no way to do it. The only way I can do is go over, say, double stack, right, like a car park block. Double capacity like that.
Sit down.
Yeah, I think so. We're just gonna kick off. Cogs at a time.
I hear you.
Yeah.
Is that marzipan? No, what is it?
I don't know what it is.
I think it's some sort of meringue. Would you like some of this?
No, I've already had 2 pieces of chocolate cake at,
It's
the-
light and fluffy, but it hardly counts as anything.
It's mostly air.
Pretty sure it comes from a tree, I'm sure. Totally
Called a
natural.
sugar tree.
It's a sad comment on our presentation skills, but that's the most important. But I won't argue, it's probably good. Okay, so I think we're gonna continue. Because I know we got a hard end time for 3 o'clock. We're going a little slower here, and I'll walk through what our way forward is going to look like. But what I'm liking is this is exactly what we were hoping to get. It's a bit of this kind of exchange where people are hearing the reality of the nuts and bolts of what it is to do ferries. I got another question before we move on from ferries.
Okay.
That is incredibly useful for an EOC to know well ahead of time before they get activated and have this stuff detailed so that we're not making assumptions of what they can and cannot do, and vice versa. They're making assumptions. The point about, well, how are you feeding people to us so that you don't overload our boats? How are we working together to do that when it's not a daily normal activation, normal operation? So that's just absolutely essential. One question I had is you mentioned your incident command structure, and it's evolving a little bit of how you guys are going to manage it. How does that notification practically work? So something's going on the island, they've activated their EOC, they recognize that there's potential for an evacuation, a waterborne evacuation of some kind, they'd like to use the ferry as the primary tool for that. How does that work? Who makes what call to whom, and then how do we codify that properly?
So that'll all go right through the Operations Security Center. So I'll have to get back to you, I'm not gonna give you.
No, totally, that's fine.
100%.
But obviously from there,
Yeah.
what I'm trying to gather from somebody in the OC here,
Yeah.
the municipality's made a decision.
Yeah.
Who talks to who talks to who talks to two, and what's their how does that work? Is that a phone call? Is that a face-to-face with somebody in the terminal here? How do we work that so that it gets to the right people and the right people making decisions in the shortest time?
I'd say the phone call to the Operations Security Center. You can call the manager over there, but the Operations Security Center is 24/7. There's always people there. There's two people, a manager and an officer
Okay,
around the clock,
all right.
and they answer the phone. Manager, you might not get through to over there. They're not there through the night.
Right.
So your primary contact would be the security center, which is in Victoria, and then they
So I'm gonna
dispatch.
pass my card if I can
Okay.
get you to, I'm not expecting this tomorrow by any means,
Yeah.
but whenever you got that stuff
Do
together.
you want like the number essentially of that?
That information, some of the details we were talking about, boats, boat move times, time it would take to marry up the boat with the crew, just whatever your estimations are on that. And whatever you can share with us.
Okay.
That would be awesome. Okay.
Quick question, sorry, I know we're in a hurry. Can
No
the
more
horseshoe be,
I'm sure. Just kidding.
can the terminal be activated in the middle of the night if it had to? Or is it open 24/7, the Horseshoe Bay terminal?
There is staff there 24/7.
Okay.
There's a skeleton crew that works on
But
the
like it was
terminal.
2 in the morning and we decided we needed to, I'm just curious.
So that'd go through the ops center. Like for instance, when they had the windstorm, I got a call at 3:30 in the morning, basically from the ops center.
Yeah.
Said, get in here.
Right, okay.
So, and then from there they'll call. They're calling superintendents. They're calling everybody.
Crew.
It's all hands on deck.
So what would be useful in addition to some of that planning information, and I'm sorry you're on the hot seat here, so
Yeah.
you guys are so critical, is what is after hours response time look like? You mentioned water tax and maybe the initial, that's what we're gonna have to do if they're working and contactable.
Yeah.
But if they go through the ops center and they say, look, we need your craft spun up because there's a fire on the island and we've got to get 1,000 people off the island. What time would it actually take you guys to do that? Could it be done in the off hours? Could you sail in?
Good question, because there's a crewing department. They start at 4 in the morning. They work till about 8:30 at night. They're the ones who contact all the staff.
Right.
The vessel obviously is not going to have. They'll have skeleton crew on there as well. Basically, just engineers who are working and doing routine
Right.
checks and stuff like that. But there would be no crew to sail that boat
Right.
at 2 in the morning.
So,
So they'd have to get that crew in, and the crew could be coming from White Rock, they come from Squamish, the
Right.
staff lives all over, so they've narrowed down, they have a list of, people that are closest. But in order to get 457 people off, they need 12 staff members.
okay. So, and I recognize you're not going to be able to give us,
Yeah.
well, it would be 12 minutes and 35 seconds. But whatever your round timings you think or realistic being, there's no move before this time because there's no staff on and there's no activating people before then.
Okay.
That kind of hard data is absolutely essential for us to consider and think about. So I really appreciate that. And it probably would be useful for you guys too to potentially think about that and work your way through some of that too. At least for this run. I'm sure you've done it for all of this stuff. Did you have any questions? No, I'm serious.
I'll let you know.
I like what we got going here. Are there any other questions then for Scott for ferries before we kind of move on to some of the other areas? I mean, a lot of it I know is being dependent on this data. We're going to ask you to come back in another session we'll talk about where we'll probably we'll work through some of these, what they actually look like once we've got some of the data, so that'll be very helpful.
Some of this might be out there, I'll just start looking around, but
Yeah.
there's some that I'm sure hasn't been looked at.
Yeah, and I guarantee you,
Like the
and
time to get the crew staffed up in the middle of the night, that's gonna be
I
tough one to
understand
get your
time,
heart
we're
number
talking
on.
window timings,
Yeah.
and so if you could say the minimum would be this,
Yep.
and the rough expected maximum would be this, that's useful. That's enough planning information for EOC to make decisions based off of, right?
Okay.
Because it's factually based. I was trying to knit it at the time. Awesome.
Can you force the crew to stay late if there's an incident happening at night?
Yep.
and it's coming up to the last ferry, and we're thinking about evacuate, can you make them stay?
Yeah, so that's in the, for the vessel crew, it's written right in their contracts and everything that if there's anything like emergencies or even if the vessel's just running behind, that they have to stay to continue.
Thanks.
And in the meantime, they can keep working and they call more people in to stave them off.
Great.
Okay. So, okay, that's a fantastic point though. So if that process did happen, when's your last sailing?
10:30?
10:30.
Yeah,
So
it changes in the summer, but
something happens, we're anticipating something getting bad. We made that notification to the office center that we ask that the crew remain, that there may be a requirement for evacuation the next, say, 2 hours, 3 hours. Would they be able to keep that crew and then, or at least find another crew and staff it in anticipation of an evacuation at 2 in the morning?
yeah, there'd be a lot of variance. We still have a 919 deal that are going until 11:30. And sometimes there's crew on there that are cleared to go on the cap, so they might be able to pull some people.
So that might be a useful consideration at the EOC level. Not saying we just pull the trigger like that haphazardly, but if we see this as a for real event, that would be a more practical way of potentially dealing with that. Okay, all right, thank you. That's a great point. Thank you very much. So, we'll move on, sir. Please.
So emergency communications, I'll start with number 2 of the 3. We have capability with amateur and commercial frequency. We have one commercial frequency on the island, which I'd like to see expanded with a repeater. We've got a new repeater going in up top for amateur communication, which is linking us completely locally throughout BC and east of the Rockies to approximately central North America. My own training with EOC, ESS, and logistics, which I've spent most of my EOC training with, doesn't leave too many gaps. However, in addition to all this, we are now connected with the North Shore Emergency Management Center, and we now have complete radio communications with all the stakeholders on the North Shore, Vancouver, etc. So we're really well connected communications-wise, and with that communications, of course, we also have access to their logistics program through their EOC. So we're now in a position now where we're doing really well. Although I'd like to say again that I would, with the one commercial frequency that is in use with maintenance staff, I'd like to see a repeater on that system to make sure that we can get into all 4 corners of Bowen because of the topography.
And that's not the case now.
And that's not the case right now. I mean, it is functional for the most part, but there are weak spots, and we don't know where those weak spots are going to be until they're there. Okay. So it's a singular frequency, but seeing it on a repeater would certainly give the capability for the stakeholders on Bowen on the commercial frequency, and then the amateur repeater that is going up there will be servicing all of Howe Sound, Sunshine Coast, Squamish, Vancouver, Richmond, etc. So it's going to be quite busy, and as I say, because it's amateur, it'll be primarily for civilian use and being used for civilian use. But the commercial frequency is really the crux of the biscuit.
So right now, the municipality has one commercial frequency.
Yeah.
That it has. It doesn't have. Do you have an alternate
Fire.
frequency?
Oh, well, yeah, but fire is something, I mean, that one commercial frequency that is with Public Works is really the crux of the biscuit to be able to be used with the stakeholders on the island. You couldn't put stakeholders on the amateur system.
Right, exactly. And the other side of it is where you're not going to be breaking into a functional police channel or a functional fire channel. So, but right now you've got one, you don't have an alternate channel to that.
Yeah, there is one commercial frequency that could be used for all the stakeholders on the island, and to make it really effective, like 100%, would be to add a repeater to it.
Okay, so that's with the existing handhelds that Public Works primarily possesses. what other capacity do you have, with, say, you're describing the amateur system, and I know there's a bunch of
The
people
amateur
scattered
system
around.
can also do IT throughout locally throughout British Columbia and approximately east of North America, midway on North America. We can do email. It's limited and it's very slow, but we still have access to it. We also have sat phones. I believe there's 2 now that we have.
There are more than 2, yeah.
Yeah, so we're doing pretty good, but the only IT capability that we've got coming off of here is on the amateur side of things. So, and I don't think.
In the event that the main network goes down.
Yeah, so if we lost all IT to the island for whatever reason, we would still be able to communicate effectively for logistical purposes, EOC logistical purposes, and we'd also be able, of course, that would also work for ESS. So there's ESS and EOC are logistically covered with the access that I now have to the North Shore's radio network system.
Okay. Any questions on that? I mean, a lot of that what you're talking about is in the worst possible scenario where networks and infrastructure is going down. For a lot of what we're talking about in the evacuation piece, we will have the benefit while your local infrastructure, wired infrastructure, might go down because literally fire can compromise it.
Yeah.
People with handheld devices are still going to have connectivity as long as the cell towers are still functioning.
Exactly.
And so that piece of it is an enabler in an evacuation. You can still use that as a system, although a functional radio network, particularly to say ESS or muster zones and the like, are a huge control measure that are very useful.
If you want more information, you can contact me and I can give you more detailed information.
No, absolutely. I'm going to be tossing you a card for sure. Thank you.
2 points, one's a point, the other's a question. We have the Bowen system, so our communications coordinator isn't here today, but it's worth noting that over 1/3 of the adult population has now enrolled for the emergency notification system. So assuming standard methods of communication are still available, we can communicate immediately with a large portion of the population through that system. I'd say one of the gaps or weaknesses is that only 4 people are trained to use it.
So you'll be able to push messaging out on it?
Correct.
Right.
Yeah. And then my second point, I'm wondering if we can jump Shuri. Shuri, are you still there?
I am.
I'm wondering
Trooper.
if she could go next, so we don't forget about you.
Okay, are we?
So I think, yeah, from my point of view, I think that's enough information for this meeting, but if you want more, I'm available.
Okay, so.
For that app, whatever you're talking about there for pushing information out, that might be something you want to give to the ops center, put them on your list for distribution. Because then they widespread, they have emails that go out from everyone from Coast Guards, they get all that information comes in.
It might be a
Coast
notification
Guards.
for them that they're going to get a call.
Yeah, so we hear about every accident, everything. The ops center will put that out, so
Okay.
that would be a good.
And that would allow them, that would trigger them to start doing some concurrent activity and early planning.
And they'll be on it right away. They'll take command of it. That's a good idea.
How many people are on the island network that you're talking about? Have radios and are active?
There's a total of, realistically, there's a total of 4 that are trained. Although they're all trained on amateur, none of them are trained on commercial work, and I'm the only one on the island who has the access to all the stakeholders on the North Shore, fire, you name it, ambulance, the whole enchilada. But that leaves 3 on the island who can work on the amateur system for civilian purposes. Does
No.
that answer your question?
Those are your team members. We know there are other amateur radio operators on the island that aren't part of that emergency
That's right.
communications team. So in an actual emergency, there are presumably more.
Okay, Shuri, thank you very much for your patience. If you can follow suit from the BC Ambulance perspective with our discussion, that'd be really great. We'd love to hear it.
Okay, so I have that's to listen. Can you just maybe outline for me?
Sure. What I'm interested in is, does BC Ambulance have any particular plans to assist with an evacuation on Bowen Island that are specific to Bowen or more generically maybe as standard operating procedures for BC Ambulance. That's the first point. And if not, that's fine, that's understandable too. What capabilities do you have to facilitate and support an evacuation of Bowen Island, both on the island and potentially meeting people on the other end at the ferry terminal? And if you have any gaps in your capability, we would appreciate just our understanding of that.
So, when an evacuation order is placed, we do not actually expect our paramedics to stay. So we would try to evacuate our paramedics. I can use the examples of the fires that we had in the previous year. Usually we will stage where the other emergency services are in a safe place, deemed by whichever incident commander, generally the fire, where there's a staging point. So we do not go into the evacuation order. So Bowen Island was on an evacuation order. We would do our best to try to actually take our ambulance and a few paramedics legal at this time off the island, and we would stage if the safe spot was Horseshoe Bay, then we would stage at Horseshoe Bay. So it would come where the staging point is for other services. Now, we utilize a private contractor to move our patients off Bowen Island, and Homeland Marine, they have a couple of boats. So I think that it would really depend on where we are in the process. If the evacuation order hadn't happened, but however there was patients, we would always do our best, assuming that it was safe for us to go in to remove the patient. But then once we are in Horseshoe Bay, if again an evacuation order is placed, we probably wouldn't come back to the island unless the incident command and the evaluation was it was safe to have responders, say in Snug Cove or wherever it was safe. So that's really our stance, is we don't go where it's not safe.
Okay.
And we protect our work. Now, of course, if there is an evacuation order, we would do our best to stage extra resources in Horseshoe Bay. Because you can imagine the panic of people coming off Bowen Island, so it would probably be a simple triage, something that we would have to liaise possibly with the ferry terminal or the town to come up with a space. I mean, luckily there's the beach area to actually do a triage if we needed to. And then resources are just based on whatever resources we have available, which can be challenging in Vancouver on any given day already. But of course, every emergency is unique, and in this case, we would try to upstaff as many medics as possible. And usually, in case of an emergency, what the direction is with our staff is it's their safety first. However, like for example, I have some local paramedics on Bowen Island. They might say if it was deemed safe, I mean, if the command site was in Snug Cove or wherever that was, they might need to stay there. Or even if they were on duty, the agreement is it's themselves and their family first. And then if they can report to duty, they're expected to report to duty. So does that help?
Yeah.
And just to confirm, you've got one ambulance on the island permanently at any given time right now that would be potentially available to assist with either injuries on the island as part of the evacuation once all the other considerations you described are taken into account, or to assist those that have serious elderly or mobility challenges to get them to the ferry terminal. But it's one apparatus effectively.
Yeah, we have one ambulance and one shooting paramedic. They run out of a road. I mean, I think again, if there isn't an evacuation order, if it's still in a preliminary site where we're trying to get people off,
right?
But there's still it's area. That's where we sometimes work with. Although you don't have a care home on Bowen, you don't have a healthcare facility, so that alleviates a lot of issues. Because otherwise, yes, we would liaise with the health authorities. We bring buses in, and that's where we load usually seniors or even some of the hospitals where we tend to evacuate. load onto buses, and then there are medics on the buses, and we move the patients away to the next hospital or clinic. That is one thing that luckily Bowen doesn't have, that we have to worry about.
Sheree, when you say we get buses, does BC Ambulance facilitate those buses, or does the health authority get the buses?
Usually it's in conjunction because we are better at the transportation of patients.
Okay.
Again, there's going to be someone in the EOC from the health authority and from the ambulance, and there's a liaison between who's going to make that call. Sometimes and usually there's either someone there from the transportation facility in that area, right? So Bowen has buses, for example, it would be really key to make sure that whoever manages your buses on Bowen would be activated in the EOC.
Yeah.
Or some facility.
We were also chatting today about vulnerable individuals and accessing, lists of these people. I'm assuming that the community paramedics in particular would have information about vulnerable individuals on the island, maybe where they were or what their specific issues were. Have you encountered or experienced any sort of information sharing where that information shared, maybe not even with the EOC, but with the RCMP? Or can you, if we're under order and your paramedics are gone, is there any way that you can tell us about those vulnerable individuals?
So it's something that we have a database that can be pulled. It's just general knowledge. So the best resource for you in that case, because in this case we're not going to be worried about breaching someone's patient privacy, would be your full paramedics, right?
And so they know that they can breach those privacy rules in the event of an evacuation?
Well, generally it would be a conversation. They would probably connect with whoever is in EOC representing them, whether that be myself or another manager. I have concerns about patients, ABCD, that live in all these really unequal houses and really hard to get to places, which I have visited with my community paramedic. And can we ensure that they would leave? So that would be a phone call to the police saying, because generally there's also a process for the police to engage in the evacuation process, right? Going door to door, whether that's going to be search and rescue that's brought into that, or whoever is tasked with that, and they're flagging each house, then we already know if there was someone in there or not in there. However, it is information that in a smaller scale could be brought forward to the RCMP to double check. But that's not really a small scale way. Really, I think the most important thing is what is your process for going door to door when you have the evacuation order and the proper tagging of inspection of houses.
I think in my mind, in this scenario, the RCMP is too overwhelmed to go door to door. But I understand that there would be a process in place for ensuring everyone's evacuated under normal conditions. Thanks.
So, it's a really good point. It's something that I'm practicing here on the Sunshine Coast, where search and rescue was tasked by the RCMP to do the door-to-door, but I know that we don't have a search and rescue team. So just something to bring up that is a really great position that is needed with experienced people that understand the process of that canvassing.
That's fantastic, Sheree. Do you have any other points for us?
That's it, unless you have some questions for me.
I'm going to hold off for a question for a second because I think you've done a good lead in, and I'd like to actually jump right over to Paolo from the RCMP to talk through the same thing, because there's a lot of similar kind of issues, and then we'll carry on.
Okay. I'll go as quickly as I can. We have 3 members on island, live and work here. So right now our current plan is very generic. We have, somebody gave me templates for any type of emergency, but it has to be a fill in the blanks for your community. So right now we work with the Bowen Island municipality and you guys, because we're going to be working with you when the time comes. So We liaise with Sea to Sky because we are out of Squamish. So Sea to Sky, if we have any resource requests or anything like that, we ask Squamish and they will provide. West Coast Marine as well, they will provide their vessel if and when we need it. And we would liaise with EOC here once it's in place. Would probably be boots on the ground. So our main focus will be general duty related things, so 911 emergencies. That would be our role in addition to door-to-door evacuation requests and responses. We have a how-to for that, telling people, you gotta go, and we have ways of convincing them. And as well with traffic hazards, if we have the power, right, the manpower. Like I said, we have 3 members. Usually we can just rely on 2 that are on the island because one might be off. So ideally 3. That's pretty much it. We have a business continuity plan for a police station. If it goes down, we go somewhere to another building. Other than that, that's pretty much what we do. And then that's one thing that I've been pushing is the best way to get everybody more volunteers, more momentum on this is to do on the ground scenarios. Because then people will be like, how do I get on that? So scenarios is what we need to do. I don't know if Jen's on top of that, but then we can see the gaps. Because do gaps exist? Yes, resources, we only have 3 of us. And as well as practicing this.
Right.
That's the gap.
So I think we've identified, and I fully acknowledge this reality, that we've seen a whole bunch of tasks. There's the maintenance of just your existing duties, not law and order related duties, the potential to assist with and facilitate the evacuation, the management of that evacuation in the sense of traffic control points and traffic flow and that type of thing, well exceeds obviously the ability of what you have in staffing here on the island.
2 cars, 3 police officers.
How long would it take to get assistance from the Sea to Sky detachment or another detachment if necessary?
Not long.
And what would those numbers potentially be realistically?
Oh, it could be depending on how quickly because we also have a fan out thing to say, come on, we need help. So it could be depending on the situation and nobody else out there needing help, at least 10, at least. We could get more. Big
How
wigs.
long would it take them to get? Obviously, I get the crossing time, but
well, West Coast Marine gets involved. It could take an hour or less, but definitely an hour approximately to get people dressed up, geared up. But if they're on duty and they say 3 members here, they can get here in less than an hour.
So if possible, they would attempt to just simply hop a regular sailing, or would the detachment coordinate with West Coast Marine to simply get the run?
Yeah, we would rely first on our own, West Coast Marine, unless there's there's a boat leaving and I'm around the area, let's hop on. But that's the whole thing, once they hop on, unless they have a BC ferry, we only have 2 cars here.
Right.
So to be on the ground.
So getting dismounted members is helpful, but to a point.
Yeah,
because they're not mobile when they
exactly. So the BC ferry.
We've moved the vehicles over often before in emergency situations, but it's North Van, I guess, would jump in, right?
Or Squamish first.
Squamish
first, yeah. But then North Van or anybody with this RCMP.
Do you guys not have a boat?
No. Right now we have a little Zodiac out of Squamish,
okay.
but West Coast Marine's going to be. I think there are improvements in the way as well.
And West Coast Marine has commercial out there? Or is that West Coast Marine assets for the RCMP?
They're RCMP they're RCMP,
Okay.
so floating detachment, pretty much.
How much can they move? How many people can move? What kind of vessel?
I don't know, it's dozens they can put in there, so it's a pretty big vessel. This has been here before, you've seen it. It's,
Where is it normally located?
It's under Nanaimo.
Oh, so it's got to make the crossing to go over.
But they do patrols. I know North Van has a boat. We have Little Zodiac. So, but we also, the hovercraft can also assist on that as well.
Yeah, unfortunately, we don't have Coast Guard with us here today. We would hope that we'll get a rep from Coast Guard for the next section to describe, because they've got significant capability as well.
Yeah.
So it's useful to know.
Maybe we can borrow some of the horses here and have actual RCMP mounted members, right?
Go back in time.
You gotta get a boots on.
Okay, awesome. I'm just cognizant of time. I really appreciate that. Yes, please.
Paula, we don't have auxiliary members anymore?
No.
We did once.
I think because the program changed, then
We used to have 1 officer and so
Okay.
that's it.
Okay. And thank you for your card and also your replacement.
Yeah.
When is he
First
coming
week of July or second week of July.
Okay, so how much of a handover is he getting with you?
2 days?
Okay.
Show them around the
Yeah.
island.
All right, okay, awesome. Let's jump into Public Works.
Slash fire.
Slash fire. Just to talk through this. I acknowledge, ladies and gentlemen, that this has been fantastic for us. We're obviously gonna go to about 3 and then we're gonna wrap it up. We're gonna have a sidebar meeting with EMBC afterwards. If I missed anything from you, can we get it from you directly afterwards?
Oh, sure.
Awesome, thank you. So let's just go through the Public Works piece and then we'll talk about what our next steps are gonna be, just so that everyone's basically out of here on time.
Do we have the room for another few minutes, Steph, if we need it? Is there anyone?
We have the room till 4:30.
Okay, thanks.
This is my first meeting regarding evacuating the island, so.
We expect you to be specific.
Yeah, I figured that. So I got 3 roads guys, so I would assume they would, first priority would make sure all avenues coming to whatever point we're leaving, try and get that open as soon as possible. If it was an evacuation to a specific area, we have 5 water guys, and if the power was out, getting power to the pumps, make sure that that area, depending on where it is, would have a constant supply of water because hydro, all those people in one area, a lot of water being used. And then all avenues are open, I guess we would just assist whatever the OC center would need.
So just run me through the numbers again that you got for.
We got 3 roads, 5 water and 1 parks, and the parks guys are firemen, so.
Okay.
So
So
it's
we
a fire,
potentially
would be
already
out
got
of the equation anyway.
And of those other 8, how many of them are also firemen?
1 more.
Okay, so potentially you got 7.
Yeah.
Okay. And the water guys, we said their role is to keep the pumps going for your water, to be able to keep the levels up.
Right, the power was out, we've got generators, we could make sure everything's running, plus the sewer plant.
Does that 8 include yourself?
No.
Okay, so it's 8 excluding you.
Yeah, and depending what's going on, if I'm at the fire department, but I'm not sure how that's gonna work out from now on, so.
Right, and that's the unique challenge of obviously volunteer departments, is making that determination of what role is more critical at that moment for your volunteer members to potentially fill, if they're also critical members of city structure too. So
Yeah.
that's something to think about as in planning.
I would probably be working here.
Right, okay. So from, are there any gaps that you really identify from the point of view of Public Works that will be a challenge? Are all your members based on the island? They all live here?
Yes.
Okay.
And they would probably make sure their families taken care of and expect them to abandon their family.
Yep, no, it's
That'd be one thing, just make sure everyone can
you
actually
either
get to this.
build that in the plan, or they're simply going to leave work anyway and take care of their family. So ideally, it's something we want to think about within our planning to ensure that they're focusing on their family, and we can try to identify where that is. We probably want to get to a stage of fidelity where we actually understand, not to be Big Brother, but to understand where all your staff live on the island, so that if there's an area of the island that's affected by an evacuation, you can automatically do an assessment, and we're potentially going to lose 15 of our staff right now for the next 3 hours while they get their families so they can ideally come back to work, if they're able to, right? And they're not a single parent and all those other things that come with that. So those are things that we'll probably get to later stages of the plan.
Yeah, and all those guys coming in too can always give us an update, guys all over the island as they're coming in.
Yep.
You can immediately report to EOC and say, hey, guess we've got 9 people just came in from all over the island, this place is blocked, or whatever the problem is.
Okay. And you guys all have communications, you all have radios?
In our work trucks.
Okay. So you don't have...
We don't carry them one-on-one at home or anything.
Gotcha. Do you have
No.
Do you have a work truck per individual, or is it per how many work trucks do you have?
Quite a few. 4 water trucks, 3 roads, 2 parks, a little utility ATV thing, a couple of 5 tons.
Okay.
Those.
So for
there is handouts for everyone, but
okay.
they just stay at the yard.
Okay,
And we
so
have 2 sat phones as well.
okay. So we're going to toss you a card and ask you to put that down in an email for us so we can capture that effectively. Okay. Because I know you'll screw it up. Okay, so we ask you to quickly put on your fire hat for a second and just walk us through that as best you can. I know it's a lot.
Again, I'm not sure if there is a fire, we would be supporting the fire. Like we've had fires we work alongside with.
Right.
Popper.
BC fire.
Yeah. We had a fire in Mount Collins, and we worked right alongside with them the whole time, the whole department.
Yeah. So realistically then, when we talk about the evacuation piece of it, and this is useful for, say the RCMP and the EOC and other pieces, you aren't really an element as a volunteer fire department. If the evacuation is driven by fire, you will not be part of the evacuation process outside of taking care of your own families and making sure they're taken care of.
Or they might be involved tactically.
Yeah.
Going door to door if people's lives are actually.
Right.
Yeah, because if it's out of control, it's gotten so
evacuation.
big, like we're just putting a garden hose on a massive fire, we probably have to switch gears and start evacuating people door to door.
But that would be the tactical evacuation under the Fire Act versus
Yes.
under the emergency. Yeah, okay. All right. So yeah, so I think that's probably useful consideration. We can get the other details, certainly from the chief and then the incoming chief and anything else that we do. That's useful key consideration to have. Is there an existing plan for how you would assist for, or how you conduct tactical evacuation?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay. We're almost at 3 right now. So what I would propose, if I can, because we are having some sidebar conversations after this, to get everybody out by 3. I was going to quickly show you what we didn't get to, and obviously Sherry will have to imagine it, although we can give you a copy of the presentation.
You can watch online, Sherry.
You can watch online, there you go. What we want to get to, once we've done this identification, is this has been brilliant, the amount of information we got out of this. We're going to be drilling down and passing on some cards and asking, in some cases, for you to send us some more detailed information. We'll be following up with you on some specific requests for information as it comes to us. But this has been a fantastic start to what we're looking to do. What we're going to propose and talk with Jennifer is we're going to look to do another session. When were you thinking?
I don't know, sometime in the future.
Okay, but not in the distant future. Ideally, I know it's coming into summer, it's coming into vacation time, but it is something we want to build on the momentum. And if we let it go until the fall, all this is going to be lost. It's not going to be fresh in people's heads. We want to jump on the new detachment commander while we have the opportunity to get him on board. So what we're going to do ideally is bring people back. We're going to be giving you some framework material ahead of time, so you're a bit more read in. We're going to be giving you some things to think about before you arrive, so you guys are a bit more prepared. If you have the ability to bring in other counterparts that might be of assistance as well, and more players from BC Wildfire, Metro Vancouver, North Shore Emergency Management, Metro Vancouver Emergency Management as well, to get some of those other key players involved. What we're going to do is basically walk through a wildfire scenario that will obviously change the date, but effectively is one where we have a wildfire that begins roughly in the middle of the island, but in one of the more mountainous areas, and effectively over time begins to travel and would be cutting off your main arterial route east-west. And what does that cause for you as a community? How do we think about evacuation? How does that change some of the discussions we've had here? How would we operationalize, without getting into finite detail, how would we operationalize our individual responses and where the coordination and interoperability concerns that come out of that? So that's what we would get to, where you'd sort of see it getting bigger, roads cut off here. You're seeing also smoke becoming a significant issue. And ultimately we'll be discussing what does initially concern about evacuation here at Snub Cove look like, but how would it eventually look like where you had to potentially evacuate the island, both from that direction, and if people cannot get through your arterial here, they're going to have to evacuate from here. And what does that look like, and how does that look like? We'll talk through that in a bit more detail. So that's going to be our objective, to get to the next level that continues to allow us to build and learn so that we can really build all of those components into the detailed plan. And that's our suggested sort of way forward from here. So I want to thank all of you for your patience in putting up with me and just being open as well in a public forum with here's what we have, here's what we don't have, here's what we can do. And I know that we ambushed you a bit with can you give us your thoughts and information, but this is all extremely helpful, and all of this is going to get incorporated and ideally build the best plan we can possibly build specific to this community, and that's what we object with all our other enablers here at the table. So I'll turn it back to Jen, and then I'll be quiet.
That's really it. I don't have anything else to say. September 4th will be our next official meeting of this committee, but I'll contact you by email to schedule, I guess we'll call it an evacuation planning committee meeting in the next immediate future. Thank you all for coming.
Are there any other questions last minute before you depart? If anything wasn't clear on anything I can answer for you, if not, we'll be remaining behind if you want to ask us anything specific. I'm going to be tossing some cards to a few of you to ask for some more information that we asked for. And obviously we're going to have a couple of sidebar quick discussions with folks that we didn't get a chance to talk to. So Thank you from our perspective. Thank you very much. It's been very helpful.
You betcha.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Sherry.
Thank you.